Happy birthday to everyone. Today is the birthday of the church. At Christmas, we celebrate the birth of Jesus. At Easter, we celebrate or commemorate his death and resurrection. And today, we celebrate the birth of the church. Now, Pentecost is a very significant day in the life of the church. However, often we read Acts 2 simply as a story and we move on. And we don't realize the impact and what it means for us today as the church. So before we go into our passage today, I want you to understand the context. And the context is when we come to Pentecost, it is 50 days after the resurrection of Jesus on the Easter Sunday. Jesus rose from the dead on that day, and in the lives of the disciples, everything changed on that day. That morning, they were all despondent that their master had been killed, and the dream they had of the kingdom of God being established under the Son of David, the Messiah, were dashed. And suddenly, that Sunday morning, the news started coming in. He is risen. And then he met with them to show himself to them. He showed them that it was him. You know the story of Thomas. And then for 40 days, he continued meeting with them. And as he continued to meet with them, there were things that he was saying to them which are very critical for us to understand, because this is what makes this day so special. So as things went on, there came a day 40 days later after his resurrection that he gathered them outside Jerusalem. And he was speaking to them about the final things that are going to happen. So when we come into today's passage, which is Acts chapter 2, if you have not noticed by now, Acts chapter 2 is where we're going to be. We'll be reading from verse 1 to 21. I'm not going to read that. It's a long passage, but it's a passage that you are most familiar with. So I'm just going to go to the few scriptures that I want us to focus on. So what we read then in the first verse of chapter 2 of Acts, it says, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. So now why does Luke start with when the day of Pentecost came? Why is he mentioning that? He's mentioning that because there was a time of waiting that had to happen. I would like us to go backwards to chapter 1 of the book of Acts to see what then happened in chapter 1. So in chapter 1, verse 4 to 5, we're told, on one occasion, while he was eating with them, he gave them this command: do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift my Father promised, which you have heard me speak about. For John baptized with water, but in a few days you'll be baptized with the Holy Spirit. This was 40 days after the resurrection of Jesus. And he says to them, do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift my Father promised you. You must remember, these are the men from Galilee. They are now in Judea, in Jerusalem. And Jesus says to them, do not leave Jerusalem, because God wants to pour out the Spirit on you while you are in Jerusalem. And that's what they do. So they stay in Jerusalem. So the reason they are gathered in Jerusalem, because it says in verse 1, they were all together in one place. So the reason they are together in one place is because they've been waiting. Because Jesus said to them, do not leave Jerusalem and go back to Galilee. Do not go back to your homes. You must wait for the Holy Spirit that my Father has promised. So there's a few things that I want us to notice here. The firstly is that they have been waiting together. They have been waiting together. Now we know when we go into chapter 2 that it says about 120 of them were there on that day. I don't know what kind of facility they had that 120 of them could be waiting together in one place. Of course, this was a special day in the Hebrew calendar. It was the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Harvest. It was a Sabbath. So all of them would have been not working or doing anything, but resting at home on that day. Jerusalem would have been full of people who had come, because 3 times a year, at Easter and at Pentecost and at the Feast of Tabernacles, a lot of Jews will travel into Jerusalem to come and worship at the temple. So many of them were there in the city. And this group of 120 disciples of Jesus are together. They are waiting together. And this is the point I think we must not forget as the church, that as we commemorate Pentecost, Pentecost reminds us that the church waited together for this day. And today, we are waiting for the return of Jesus. And once again, the principle is we must wait together. We must never allow anything to disperse us, to force us to fall apart, but we must continue to tarry together, to wait together until that moment God will move. Now, I don't know whether you noticed when we read Acts chapter 1, verse 5. It says, Jesus said, for John baptized with water, but in a few days you'll be baptized with the Holy Spirit. What is a few days in your mind? If somebody comes to you and say, look, I'm coming back in a few days. Or don't worry, the money I owe you, I'll pay you in a few days. What does that mean for you? Does it mean 3 days? Does it mean 4 days? Does it mean 5 days? Does it mean 7 days? How long is a few days? Because I can assure you, from that day when Jesus told them, in a few days this will happen, every day when they woke up, they wondered, is it today? And then the first day passed. The second day followed. The third day followed. The fifth, the sixth, the seventh, the eighth, the ninth, and the 10th day, boom, it happened. And this is what we see even when we read verse 2 of chapter 2. It says, suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. So while they were waiting, suddenly on the 10th day, there was a sound of a mighty wind shaking the house where they were. And suddenly they saw tongues of fire coming and alighting on them. And the Spirit had arrived. So I want to remind you that sometimes when the waiting appears like it is too long, we tend to lose hope. And I'm not sure whether by the 10th day, they were beginning to wonder, what did Jesus mean by a few days? It has been 10 days already since he told us this. And yet it says on the 10th day, suddenly it happened. And this is what is going to happen. We are waiting for Jesus, because when he left, those of you who might not have seen the video up we posted a week ago about the ascension, we mentioned that the ascension reminds us Jesus is coming back. Because as the disciples were standing on that day and saw Jesus disappearing into the skies, angels came and said, men of Galilee, why are you standing here staring into the heavens? This same Jesus that you saw going up will come back the same way you saw him go. And I believe, and the scriptures tells us the same, that as we wait, it might look like we're waiting long. It has been 2,000 years since he ascended to heaven. But I want to remind you today, just like suddenly the Spirit came, suddenly Jesus will return. It says at the blink of an eye, at the sound of a trumpet, Jesus will come back. The trumpet will sound. So don't forget that. Just as it was sudden on Pentecost Day when the Spirit came, it will be sudden when Jesus returns. And that is what the story of Pentecost reminds us. that it doesn't matter how long you wait. When the event arrives, it will be sudden. And many go to sleep. Many are forgetting that Jesus is coming back. And when he comes back, they will be caught by surprise. Many times in the scriptures, Jesus himself said, when the Son of Man comes, he will come like a thief in the night. The thief doesn't announce. He doesn't announce when he's going to come. Suddenly, he's breaking in and he's stealing. And that's what Jesus will do. He will come suddenly. Then verse 4 of chapter 2 says, all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit enabled them. So the Spirit descended and it alighted on them, and they started speaking in other languages. They started speaking in languages that they, as Galileans, probably, because they were Galileans, most of them probably were not well traveled. All their lives were Galileans. The furthest they probably have traveled was Jerusalem itself. So chances are the only languages they knew was Aramaic, the language they spoke at home. They didn't know all these other languages. And yet when the Spirit came, they started speaking all these languages. And the question is, why did the Spirit make them start speaking in these other languages? Now, I'm specifically using the word languages and not tongues. Okay? So most of the time, the Bible will say they spoke in tongues or in other tongues. Now, that's not the language or the words we use today in our everyday language. Today, when we speak about a language, we use the word language, not the word tongue. Okay? We may talk about the mother tongue language, but the point is that we're talking about a language. So I want us to talk about language. That when it talks about them speaking in tongues here, it's talking about them speaking in other languages. Okay? Not in so-called languages of the angels, if there is such a language to start with. They were talking real languages. So why did they speak in these other languages? We're told there in Acts 2 that there were, and it lists the number of languages that these people were speaking, that the hearers were hearing them speaking their own languages. Okay? Now, it is important here, there are some people who say what happened on that day was the miracle in the hearing of the people. Were these people speaking Aramaic and the hearers hearing their own languages? Or were these people speaking the languages of the hearers? I think the text seems to indicate that they heard them speaking their languages. Okay? They were actually speaking those languages. They were not speaking Aramaic, they were speaking those languages. And those people were hearing those languages being spoken. And that's important to note. Okay? Now, the reason God did this was because God wanted to start this worldwide mission of the church. That the gospel is going to reach into all languages. I don't know whether you have a Bible app on your phone. I have one called YouVersion. I don't know how many translations it has in English alone. And then it also has other languages. I don't know how many languages it has. It has even my own language, Chivenda. It's on that app. So the Bible has been translated in almost every language in the world today. Because Pentecost says the gospel will be preached into all communities, into all nations, into all groups of people, in all languages. And that is what has happened. The fact that these guys were speaking in all these languages was a prophecy, a foreshadow of the fact that the gospel was going to reach into all corners of the world, that it will be preached in all languages. I find it fascinating that God has not chosen a specific language as a preferred language. Even at the time of Jesus, the Bible was no longer in Hebrew, it was in Greek. The Pharisees and the religious people of Jerusalem were no longer reading the Aramaic scriptures. They were reading the Greek scriptures, translation of the Hebrew. And then a few years later, the Bible was translated from Greek into Latin. And for many years, the scriptures were in Latin. Then it moved from Latin to English and then started going into all the other languages. Because that has always been the plan of God, that his word is going to reach into all nations, into all languages. And that's the spirit of Pentecost. And sometimes, for example, as a vendor person, there are times when I feel like worshiping and singing vendor songs, beautiful worship songs. But because we are meeting in an English setting, it is difficult to do that. But I think if we are to live out the spirit of Pentecost, we need to become more comfortable with singing songs in all kinds of languages in our worship. If we don't understand those songs, we must at least get translations and be able to understand what is being said. But I think we do Pentecost justice by worshiping in all languages and not in one language. We must try to do that, to say, what are the songs in other languages that I can sing that expresses? Because there are certain things that can only be said in certain languages in a particular way. And when you translate them, they don't come across. And I think that's what the diversity of the church is. There are people who say, for example, that what happened on Pentecost, and I used to think that what happened on Pentecost was a reversal of what happened in Babel in Genesis chapter 11, where God came and confused the languages of the people so that they spoke different languages and stopped building the Tower of Babel. I used to think on Pentecost, God then brought them into one language, but that's not true. On Pentecost, God is not restoring the many languages into one language. He is simply making us understand those languages that started at Babel. And he says, whatever the languages are, the people will understand the gospel in those languages. That is what is happening on Pentecost. Pentecost doesn't say this language is more important. It doesn't say Greek is better. It doesn't say Hebrew is better. It doesn't say Aramaic is better. It doesn't say Latin is better. It says all the languages of the hearers, all the languages of the people that God wants to call are important. And we hear the disciples speaking in those languages. And that is why I believe they started speaking in all these languages and people could hear them. And today, that is something that I think as a church we must preserve. The church is the church because of its diversity. That we have all these different languages in one church. For me, it is almost a disappointment. For example, when you hear there is how do I call it? A Zulu church or a Venda church. And so it is fine if everybody is Venda and you preach in Venda, and so that's fine. But we should never label a church according to language group, where we make it clear that others are not welcome. I've seen in the cities, and I know it might be because people want to worship in their own languages, but why not combine the worship styles so that the different songs of different languages are shared and sung in the same service? Because I've seen other churches, they will have 3 services. They'll have one service in English, one service in Afrikaans, one service maybe in Zulu or Sotho. And they divide the people up. That is not the spirit of Pentecost. Pentecost brings everybody to understand each other as one community. They are not separated into their corners. They are one community. And I think we should resist the temptation in the future, if we do grow to the point where we have several languages in our churches, that we think we must have different services to cater for different languages. We should rather sing songs in different languages, allow people to pray in their own languages, and allow people to preach in their own languages, and do translation if you have to. But it is an inconvenience, but it is something that we must do for the sake of what Pentecost represents. Pentecost represents that the gospel is going into the whole world. All languages are going to be reached, and the church must reflect that. We must not sacrifice the diversity and unity of the church for the sake of convenience. Let's try to maintain that spirit of unity in diversity, because that's what the church is. Verse 16 and 18, if I could just read those verses. It says now, no, this is because people were saying now, are these people drunk or what? Why are they speaking all these languages? Because that's what the people do. When people are drunk, they start speaking other languages, whatever the case may be. I've seen that in the Shebeens, people start speaking Afrikaans or English or whatever because they are drunk. So the people who saw these people speaking these languages, they thought they are drunk. So Peter stands up, and this is what he says in verse 16 to 18. He says, no, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. Now, there are many reasons why the Spirit was given by God. Jesus, on the Last Supper, he told them why God will send the Spirit. That the Spirit will teach them the things, will remind them of the things that he told them. That the Spirit will help them be convicted of sin, that they will see their lives for what they are. That the Spirit will give them power. The Spirit will give them wisdom. The Spirit will give them the love and the gentleness and the self-control that they require, the fruits of the Spirit that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13. So these are all the reasons that the Spirit came. But on Pentecost Day, and 10 days before when Jesus ascended to heaven, there is one specific reason that he mentioned why the Spirit was coming. And I want us to be reminded of that point today. Let's not forget why Jesus said the Spirit was going to come in 10 days' time. But before we go into that, I just want you to notice that Peter says what is happening here is what the prophet Joel said. And he quotes the prophet Joel. He said, God said, in the last days, I will pour out my Spirit on all people, not just on Jews. And I don't understand, sometimes it's very difficult to see how come people like Peter, even in Acts chapter 10, is still struggling to understand that the gospel is for everyone. And yet here on Pentecost, he's quoting this verse. He can begin to see the Spirit is showing him that Joel spoke about this, that the Spirit will come upon all people. Perhaps in their minds, all people were still just Jews. Because then he goes on to say, your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. And my servants, both men and women, will prophesy. So maybe that's, he was still thinking within the Jewish community. But something I want to understand here is that there's almost a disruption of the social structures. That no longer will the Spirit be for the old people only, but the Spirit will also come on your sons and daughters. Now we must understand that in that generation, when you were 20, you were an adult. Most of the time you were married by then. So when he talks about sons and daughters, he's talking about children. He's talking about people who are probably below the age of 16. That's the sons and daughters it's talking about. That they will prophesy. Now, this is one of those things I think, even as a church today, we still struggle with. Not just our church, all churches. We still struggle with this. That somehow we don't seem to accept that God may be wanting to work and use young people. And so we don't allow them to get involved. We don't allow them to do certain things in the church because they are still too young. The message of Pentecost is not that. The message of Pentecost is that God says, in the last days, I'm going to pour out my Spirit on all people, including your sons and daughters, your young people. And they will prophesy. Now, prophesy here does not mean fortune telling. It doesn't mean telling somebody, you have 5 sisters that you have never met. You have 5 sisters and one of them died. And so it is not about fortune telling. The prophesying is what Peter was doing. Peter, when he quoted Prophet Joel, he was prophesying the same thing that Joel has prophesied. to say in the last days God will do this. So today, when we talk about prophesy, we're talking about preaching. Because we cannot preach without talking about the prophecies of the past or prophecies about the future of what's going to happen. So when I talk about the fact that Jesus is going to come suddenly, I'm prophesying because that's what the prophecies have said. That's what prophesying is in this context. It is not telling fortunes to people, to tell them what is going to happen tomorrow in their own personal life. It is about talking about the prophecies of the scriptures. That's what the prophesy we're talking about. And here we're told that your young men, your sons and daughters are going to prophesy. Young men will see visions. Young men will see things of the future. I don't know how many of you out there who are listening now in this service are young men and women. Because this passage from Joel that Peter quotes on Pentecost says, young men will see visions. I'm not sure whether our young people are seeing this vision that we have. We've tried to describe Vision 2025. Now that is a future that some of us will be getting old by then. Some of us are already old. And it's a future that will be occupied by the current young people. The question is, can they see this vision? Because according to the Spirit of Pentecost, they will see visions. They will see a future that their parents can't see. And I want to challenge you as a young person that you must call upon God and say, fill me with your Spirit, that I may see this vision of the future that you see and I don't see. If you can't see the vision of where the church is going, I ask that you must pray and ask God to fill you with the Spirit that you may see this vision. He says, old men will dream dreams. We have many old people in our church. What are the dreams that God is giving you that you need to be telling the young people that don't give up? Something is going to happen. This is the dream I've seen. There's a future that God has shown me in the dream. What are the dreams you have? God still talks through the dreams, but often we don't know how to interpret those dreams. Let's ask God, if we're old men, Pentecost says you're going to have dreams. What are the dreams you're having? Let's ask God to show us what those dreams are. And then it says, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit and they will prophesy. Now, it took many years. In fact, it is still not over yet. That many churches still struggle with the idea that women will preach. But here the Spirit of Pentecost is, both men and women will prophesy. Some churches still prohibit women from prophesying, from preaching, from declaring the truth of the gospel to people. In our church, in JCI, we believe in the Spirit of Pentecost, that the Spirit of God has been poured upon all flesh, on men and women, and that both of them can and will and should prophesy. So thank you for all the women in our church who have listened to the Spirit and are prophesying, and they are ministering in many of our churches. Please continue that work. And I want the young girls growing up to also see that and become that. Because that's what the Spirit of Pentecost is. That the Spirit of God has been poured on all of us, young and old, male and female, slave or free. All of us, because the Spirit has come upon us, we will prophesy. Now, as I said, the prophesying here is not fortune telling. It is preaching the gospel. That's what it is. I've mentioned also that there are many reasons why God has given us His Spirit. But sometimes we might get lost as to the reasons why He has given us His Spirit. So I want us to zero in as we finish on the one reason Jesus said the Spirit was going to come. Let's go back to chapter 1 of the book of Acts. Chapter 1, verse 8 and 9. It says, but you will receive power when the Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. After he said this, he was taken away. Now, I know when we celebrate or commemorate Easter, when we talk about the Last Supper, we take the words of Jesus that were said that evening very seriously, because we say, these are the words of a man who was about to die. But I want you to notice that those were not his last words, because Jesus 3 days later rose from the dead, and he spent 40 days with the disciples, teaching them other things. So there are many other things that he said after the Last Supper. So the Last Supper was not the last moment he had the opportunity to speak to the disciples. So I want us to notice that here in Acts chapter 1, verse 8 and 9, it says, Jesus says to them, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And it says, after he said this, he was lifted and he ascended into heaven. So the very last words that Jesus spoke in this world, I'll repeat that. The very last words that Jesus spoke in the world before he ascended into heaven were these words. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the world. That is the last message Jesus gave the church, that you will be my witnesses. So if you want to know what was the most important message Jesus wanted to give his church that was about to be born in 10 days' time, he said to them, wait here in Jerusalem. The Father is going to send the Spirit. And when the Spirit comes, you're going to have power. And that power is not for you to go entertain people. It's not for you to come and to perform miracles and entertain people and satisfy people's curiosity. That power will be for you to be my witnesses, to preach the gospel to the ends of the world. That is why the Spirit came. That is why the sons and daughters are prophesying. That is why the young men will see visions. That is why the men and women will prophesy. It is so that the gospel can be preached into all the world. So the one instruction that Jesus gave as the last instruction to us today is that we must be witnesses. The Spirit has come upon us so that we can be his witnesses, so that the church can be a witness in the world, witness to what Jesus has done for the world, so that people can be saved. That is what the reason of the Spirit is. I'm not saying the other reasons are not important. They are mentioned by Scripture. But I want us to understand, because often when you talk about the Spirit, we even talk about the fruits of the Spirit. We talk about all these other things. But I want you to notice that the Spirit was not given simply so that we can speak in tongues. The Spirit was not given so that we can have more inspiring worship. The Spirit was not given so that we may pray better. The Spirit was not given so that we can sing better. The Spirit was given so that we can be witnesses to Jesus, so that we can go out and preach the gospel. That's the reason the Spirit was poured out on the day of Pentecost. And as we know, on that very same day, Peter stood up and started preaching. And that kicked off the worldwide spread of the gospel. And today the gospel is here in South Africa. It is here in Southern Africa, in Mozambique, in Namibia, in Mauritius, in Madagascar, in Nigeria. It is all over the world because of what happened on that day. Because Jesus said God is pouring out the Spirit so that sons and daughters, men and women, young men and old men will prophesy. They will spread this good news into all languages. That is what the Spirit of Pentecost is. When as a church we fail to be a witness to the gospel, to be a witness to Jesus Christ, we fail in the one thing that Jesus gave the church to do. Our church, we have Vision 2025 in Southern Africa. And that vision says we are going to be a healthy church. We want to be a healthy church that is living and sharing the gospel through the ministry avenue of hope, faith, and love. And love represents us sharing the love of God with the world. It represents witnessing to the world. It represents reaching out in the world with the good news. That is what we believe a healthy church is. A healthy church is a church that is preaching the gospel. If we're a church that just worships and attends Bible studies, we are not being a healthy church. The Spirit has come so that you and I can be witnesses. And that is the challenge that Jesus gave his church. And that challenge remains today. You and I are supposed to continue with this mission of preaching the gospel to the whole world. A church that is not reaching out with the gospel has forgotten Pentecost. And today, as we celebrate and commemorate Pentecost and the birth of the church, I want us to be reminded that the Spirit has come so that we preach the gospel. Now, preaching the gospel doesn't mean going and standing in a street corner. It might include that. And those that can do that, you must do that. But it means a lot of things that we collectively can do to preach the gospel. It means inviting friends to church that they too can hear the gospel. It means praying for your friends who are not Christian, that they may know that there is a faith in you. You believe in the God who created the heavens and the earth, who cares about humans. That when we are sick, we can go to. Pray for them, pray for their situations. You never know what God is going to do, because a prayer of a righteous man avails much. That's what James says. So sometimes you just need to pray for people. And that is what it represents, because praying itself is a proclamation of what the gospel is. Because to pray is to believe in God, is to believe in Jesus, that God is there and he listens to our prayers. That is what we should do to preach the gospel. It means to fund the church. Okay? You may not be able to do many things, but you might have money that you are able to put in the church, that the church can do its work. That there can be people who can be sent out to do this work. That is what it means. So to be witnesses doesn't mean you personally standing and preaching. It means that you are participating in the collective effort of the church to be a witness, to preach the gospel. And the question is, what are we collectively doing? What are you personally doing? Because that's what we are supposed to be as the church, to be witnesses to the gospel of Jesus Christ. We must never forget to do that. That's what we are called to do. So let's conclude. Today, as we commemorate this Pentecost, I wanted us to be reminded that the gospel has gone out into the whole world, into all languages. And perhaps it's time that we begin to embrace all languages in our worship services. That we don't try to silence them, but we allow space that our church can represent what happened on Pentecost Day. That within that hall, wherever they were gathering, that many languages were heard on that day, because the Spirit allowed all those languages to come in. And in our worship services, let's allow this to happen. Let's not silence other languages when we worship, when we pray, when we preach. Let's allow that diversity to be the one that drives us, because that's the spirit of Pentecost. And the point of Pentecost, as we concluded, is that the Spirit is coming so that we can preach the gospel. We preach the gospel so that, as it says in Acts 2 verse 21, which is the last verse of today's passage, it says, and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's the objective. The Spirit came down so that we can have power to be witnesses to the gospel, so that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Happy birthday, happy Pentecost. Amen.